Hello, friends, and welcome to Worldbuild with Us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds with help from you, our listeners. My name is Rob Hilferty, and I'm here with my co-hosts Daniel Quinn and Courtney Staples. On today's episode, we have an interview with Dr. Christopher Ferguson. We'll call him Chris for short. But before we get to that interview, we always want to remind you that if you want us to build your worlds, you can always go to our website, worldbuildwithus.com, submit a prompt, and we will build your world live on air. Not live, kind of pre-recorded, but still all the same thing. If you want to follow us on social media, we are on Twitter over at Let's Worldbuild. If you want to come join our Discord and have discussions with us there, we always think that's probably a little bit easier. There's a link for that in the description. And of course, if you're feeling particularly generous or you just want our sweet, sweet patron-only episodes, you can follow our link for our Patreon below. Now, on to the interview. Hello, and today we are joined by Dr. Chris Ferguson. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, it's awesome to be on. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Chris, for those of us who don't know anything about you, coming in brand new and clean, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So, So what I like to say about myself. So I'm a psychology professor at Stetson University. I'm actually a clinical psychologist, licensed in Texas, and I mostly do research on media effects. And a large part of that over the last 2 decades really has been on video games and video game violence and all that kind of stuff. So I was really involved in that debate, which seems to be finally dying off. So I'm kind of looking for new things to get myself in trouble with at this point. But I did a wide range of research in body image and media, and I did a couple things on 13 Reasons Why when that was a thing a few years ago, and a few other areas as well. And more recently, I've gotten involved in some of the debates about like Dungeons and Dragons which have resurfaced in the last few years. So I'm always looking to see what people are upset about, and then trying to bring some data to hopefully help shape some of those arguments that are going on. And I'm also married, and I have a 18-year-old son. So other than that, I don't really think there's anything terribly fascinating about me.
We're just gonna skip over your being an author as well. Or...
Okay, I guess so. That's true. I have written a few books. So I have one that's just out. Well, the last couple of years have been out. How Madness Shaped History, which is more or less what it says on the box, and sort of an intersection of history and psychology, focusing in on all kind of like all bad stuff, which is really what interests me. And then I have one on video games, moral combat, why the war on violent video games is wrong, which again is pretty much what it says on the box. And I actually did write, sort of like world building and stuff. I actually did write a mystery novel set in Renaissance Florence. So that was a lot of fun to write. If I had more time, I'd write more fiction, I think, than all these academic articles nobody reads.
And you've fallen into our trap, which is, of course, anyone who is a longtime listener will know that I love history. And when you hit me with a Florentine mystery set during the Renaissance, I have to know a little bit more about that. So first, let's start with the very obvious question about all of your books. Are any of them good?
They're so you should really stop reading Stephen King. I mean, he's an amateur, compared to what I can provide, for you all. Yeah, no, I love him. I think so. I mean, I'm actually not yet ready to compete with the Stephen King empire, but I enjoyed writing them. I can say that much. And, it seems like a few people enjoy reading them.
Absolutely.
So it's always good to increase that base of people who give it a shot. But check out the books, read them. If you love them, write a review on Amazon. If you don't write a review on Amazon.
Excellent.
That's my suggestion.
And speaking of history, of course, can we get into your history of like why you got into not just games or video games, but tabletop RPGs as well? Because those are two fields of interest that you seem to be you have a vested interest in. You have a love for those topics. Yeah. So I'd love to hear where your kind of origin story, because I feel like that's another good place we can start.
Yeah. Well, I'm a total geek, basically. So probably back, in the early 80s, when Dungeons and Dragons was first edition, and I was probably like 11 or something like that, is when I first started playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I've been a Dungeons and Dragons and to a much lesser extent Pathfinder player since I was really a middle school, probably a late elementary, middle school kid. So that's been 4 decades at this point. I'm getting old, and I've always loved it, and I still play, a couple times a week, mostly
Hmm.
online these
Mhm.
days. But still, for me, it's a big stress reducer, and I love it. And getting into the head of another fictional person is always a lot of fun, and building
Hmm.
these stories is always a lot of fun. I like kind of complicated narratives and all that stuff, so it's a lot of fun to be involved in that stuff. But I also kind of lived through that period, in the early years of Dungeons and Dragons, where there was this kind of like Satan panic, and the idea is like,
Hmm.
you were going to run off and commit suicide, or engage in violence or develop schizophrenia. Really kind of
Summon the devil. Yeah.
yeah,
Typical
really kind
stuff.
of silly stuff. I mean, it's kind of laughable at this point,
Yeah.
to look at what happened with Dungeons and Dragons. But
Mhm.
I kind of did live through that, and at the same point, there were panics over like rock and roll music, around
Hmm. Hmm.
everything from Cyndi Lauper to AC/DC. Same basic arguments: suicide, violence, Satanism. I don't know how Cyndi Lauper got roped into that, but she did. And but and then there were my like wasted 20s, basically, and I didn't really kind of come back to have anything constructive to contribute to any of this until I got back into graduate school. And when I was getting my PhD in clinical psychology, I was originally really interested in studying. There's these different groups of like undergraduate psychology majors. There's kind of like the group that started off as a bio major and realized that was hard and decided psychology was easier. There's kind of the group that want to learn about like why they or their family are mentally ill, and then there are the people who watch Silence of the Lambs, and I was really in that last category
Wow.
of a person. So I didn't really have like a good reason. I wasn't trying to help anybody for getting into psychology. I just wanted to study like serial killers and stuff like that. But I actually did do research on inmates, so I was working with, in sort of a crossover between psychology and criminal justice. And that was actually kind of how I ended up becoming involved in the video game stuff, is because that was right around the time of the Columbine massacre. And
Mm.
this was a couple years after 1999, but it was pretty close to it. And so there were these big debates about video games, and people were
Mhm.
saying really kind of ridiculous things, like that these mass homicides were caused by video games, and the effects of video games on aggression were similar to smoking and lung cancer, and that 30% of violent crimes would go away if only we got rid of violent television and video games and
Jeez.
stuff. Yeah, it
Wow.
was, and these were scholars, saying these things, and politicians,
Hmm.
of course, repeating
Mhm.
them. And so there's this like defect in my personality that the more someone tells me that something's absolutely true, the less I believe them, and so I get
Me
really
too.
curious. And that was sort of what led me into the video game stuff. Even though, I mean, I played video games, and so I certainly enjoy video games, and I guess would consider myself a gamer. But it really was this curiosity about how nuts some scholars had gotten over this issue, and I wanted to see what the actual data looked like. And it turns out it's way easier to study video games than it is mass homicide perpetrators. So it ended up being super productive for me. So I just became this kind of like video game researcher guy. And then that broadened out to, well, if this field is in so much trouble, what about like the idea that looking at thin actresses causes eating disorders? Could that be wrong too?
Mm.
And so that got me
Mhm.
in, I wanted to look at that. Well, what about this thing about 13 reasons why and suicide? So it just kind of broadened out from there, and then finally full circle back to Dungeons and Dragons in the last couple of years. So that's kind of the narrative.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I think that that's a really interesting journey in and of itself.
Mhm.
And I feel like the journey that you're seeing now, especially with video games, is becoming like so much more part of the culture.
Mm,
And there's that cultural acceptance that we've seen that's come a long way, even since I was a kid. Back then it's like you were a nerd if you played video games. And now it's like, yeah, I'm a dad who plays, like video games on my night off or something like
hmm
that. There's an absorption in the culture that we're seeing with video games that I think is, I think we're seeing a normalization of the habit in general.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can see references to video games. I remember going to a hockey game just, the last year, post COVID, and they had, some music where, like, I just remember this usher. So one of the guys that, kind of like worked at this theater, well, not theater, but stadium, doing the floss, in the middle of, sort of on camera, while this hockey game was going on, which of course is sort of a reference to Fortnite. So even in indirect ways, a lot of references to video games are, have made their way into popular culture and such. And so, yeah, I mean, we're seeing that sort of normalization. I mean, we still do get, the occasional old dude waving his cane, at the kids crossing the yard, kids who
Mhm.
there with their music and their video games. And, so that contingent still is existing. But, what's happening is essentially the same as what happened with rock music in the 80s and radio in the
Mm,
1940s and comic books in the 1950s, is that audience of old people who didn't like it are dying,
yeah.
and that's sort of the solution. I guess, in a way. I'm not advocating this, by the way. I don't, if Ferguson advocates genocide of old people, and no, but that's kind of how, moral panics tend to go away. Is eventually the audience for those panics, just ages out. And yeah, I would just add an Alice Cooper concert, and back in the '70s, he was controversial because of his,
Mhm.
Yeah.
horror themed shows, and
Mhm.
now, it's all old people going. He's 74, so that's just the way it goes.
Yeah.
And speaking of normalizations, with tabletop games, I feel like we're almost there too, where it's starting to be a thing that mainstream audiences understand to some degree. So I had some questions specifically in the psych world, because Mortal Kombat has chock full of information about the myths of violence in video games. But what do we know, like from a clinical research point of view, about tabletop games, if anything? Like I'm wondering, because one of the facts that came up that I thought was really cool was how like engagement with violent media actually decreases
Mm,
violence in the real world, which was
yeah,
surprising. And I
Mhm.
remember growing up with tabletop games when I was like, I don't know, 13. It's probably when I first started playing. It was like second edition.
yeah.
And I feel like it made me more socially capable over time. So
Mhm.
I'm
Mm,
wondering like, and as I continue to play, like I feel more comfortable speaking publicly too. So it's
yeah.
like, is there any known relationship or is it something that's just not explored yet?
Yeah, it's not as explored as thoroughly as video games, and there really are two main reasons for that. Is one, other than that period in the '80s, and now perhaps a bit more recently, now with sort of the debate over like orcs and racism and that kind of stuff,
Mm,
there really haven't been as big, as consistent an outcry about Dungeons and Dragons, particularly during these kind of like '90s and 2000s, which really were these kind of like good years for video game research. I don't mean good like the research was good, but in terms of like, a lot of it was produced,
Mhm.
during those years. And also just that, and scholars do respond to these, like, like, there's money, right, laying around when
Right.
like society is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
This is there's cash to be had, and we want to feed our families too,
Mhm.
but but there also is a sense of like video games are really easy to study, right? That was kind of my comment about much easier than mass homicide perpetrators. But
Mhm.
so you can bring people, you can bring college students into the lab and have them play different video games for half an hour, and then measure them on some level of, it's going to be obviously very mild aggression. We can't have people beat each other up in
Mhm.
the lab,
Yeah.
as much fun as that would be. But
Mhm.
the rules get in the way, as they always do. But so with Dungeons and Dragons, I mean, these are like games that take place over hours and days and
Mm,
weeks
Yeah.
and months and
Mhm.
Mhm.
years, and so getting the same sort of experience out of that, even if you're going to have one session, we're really talking 3-4 hours, as opposed to a 30-minute video game, so
Mhm.
that puts a lot of roadblocks in the way of sort of studying that, at least in experimental studies. Now you can do correlational survey based studies and do stuff like that, but there again, I don't think that right now there's, even with the sort of like orc racism debate, that there's really that much energy behind it, or at least there don't
Mhm.
seem to be a lot of like grant dollars laying
right.
around
Mhm.
to study this thing. So there's not a ton of energy behind doing research. So we don't really know a lot in terms of like negative effects. There has been some energy around the idea of like using Dungeons and Dragons in therapy, So,
Yeah.
and
Oh,
again,
okay. Yeah.
we're
Mhm.
still talking about like a handful of
That's
studies,
interesting.
and so I think like you're referring to, you can like take people who may, for a variety of reasons, struggle with making social connections, and bring them together in this sort of, I'm going to call it a play setting, and that I just mean that very broadly, but a fun setting, and you can work within that setting both to reduce anxiety and stress, but also to develop social skills, and things like
Hmm.
that. And so the evidence there,
Mhm.
it's not a huge evidence base, but the evidence base does seem to suggest that Dungeons and Dragons is effective, at least for certain populations of individuals, as a way of making therapy stick, or making therapy
Mm.
work well with those particular groups of individuals.
Sounds like we need to give you more money so that you
Mm.
can do
Always.
more
Yeah.
studies.
Well, speaking of studies, I'm not sure if this was an official or a psychological study or anything like that, but I do remember reading an article about prison groups who would have RPG sessions
Mm,
after they are released from prison,
mhm,
and how having that community of people and having that community like to build, like upon actually helps with recidivism rates when it
mhm,
comes to like them going back to prison. So it kind of
Mm.
keeps them on like a fairly it's a stabilizing element once they're
yeah.
released from prison. So I find that to be really interesting as well. And I feel like there's so much opportunity for research to go into this topic that's just been completely untouched.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, well, it's definitely the case. I mean, former felons in particular, we kind of
Mhm.
think of like the group of like nonviolent felons. That's a particular group of individuals who really have a tough time,
Mm.
coming out of prison, being
Mm.
on parole, and they do face the social stigma, and
Mhm.
they face economic stigma as well because people don't want to hire them. So yeah, we do find that issue. And in fact, this is another area of research I'm getting involved in, sort of on the side, is getting back into criminal justice a bit. But yeah, we do see that as a problem. Is that we bring people back out of prison and we want them to function in society, but then we cut them off from social contact and
Right.
we
Mm.
don't let them
Right.
be employed. And then we wonder why they commit crimes again.
Right,
And
because when you cut them off from anything that might be a stabilizing or good effect,
yeah,
they're forced to go back to their like underworld contacts
Right.
because that's the
absolutely.
only force that they have. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so anything that we can do, and that, obviously for, inmates who enjoy, or former inmates who enjoy role playing games, and anything you can do to develop these social contacts is going to make their lives easier. First off, they have the social support, but then they also have the networks that may help them find employment, which is going to be,
Mm,
really the predictor of, reducing recidivism in the future.
absolutely. Yeah.
This is specific to Mortal Kombat because I just recently listened to it. I was listening it to audio, and we're talking about prisons, and we're kind of talking about the effects of RPGs on people. So you mentioned in Mortal Kombat, I think it was Mass Effect, they were talking about how like the choice of kind of the moral path you take in the game actually has an impact or is related to, I guess, the moral attitude that you have as a player,
Hmm.
if I have that right. I know I'm wondering, granted, this is total speculation. We don't have any real research on RPGs, but RPGs often have alignments in some capacity, like some
Yeah.
moral point of view to pick when you play a character.
Mm.
Could you talk more about the Mass Effect situation and then like what could that mean with tabletops?
Yeah, what we tend to find fairly consistently is with players in video games that if you give them moral choices, that gamers will, the average, we're like 90%. There's always there's always a few like budding psychopaths out there, but 95% of gamers will choose a path that is more difficult but more moral over a course of or a path
Mm.
that is less difficult but less moral. And so actually, a lot of this data came from the Walking Dead video game, where
Oh, really?
the
Oh,
company,
yeah.
I forget the company's name,
Telltale.
actually collected a lot of this data. They
Mhm.
found that the players really would choose a harder path if that meant sort of preserving their sense of moral integrity, if you will. This is a
Mm.
video game. These are not like live human beings.
Right.
Right.
These
Yeah.
pixels don't
Mhm.
really matter.
Mhm.
But we develop that sense of wanting to be consistent in our play universes with our moral concepts of what is good and what is right in the real world as well. And you can see this in other places too. I usually try to be upfront and say I've never actually played The Last of Us 2. I played the first game, I haven't played the second one. But
Mhm.
Mhm.
so I don't know if this is true, but I remember hearing complaints from some players about it, in the sense of like, again, this is just what I heard, that some people didn't like it because there are apparently these dogs in the game, and you kind of get forced into the position of like killing them.
Mm.
Oh, okay.
And then the game sort of lectures you about it. I guess no. That again, maybe that's not true. That's just what I heard. But you can see there too that players get uncomfortable if you kind of like shove them into this moral situation where you don't give them any choice, and then they're made to do something, bad. The no Russian level from one of the old Call
Yeah.
of Duties was kind of similar to that as well. So yeah, people do seem to really kind of want to, occasionally they may dabble with, hey, let's have an evil campaign, whatever. But it seems like for the most part, people really are tied into this narrative of, good versus evil, with us being on the side of good and trying to do the right thing, for the most part. And most people will tend to get more enjoyment out of that sort of narrative. Again, having played for 40 years and occasionally seeing people say, let's try an evil PC game, and it lasts for like 3 sessions, and people
Mhm.
get bored, and it
Yeah.
just isn't fun anymore. And that tends to be what happens. So yeah, that's good news, right? Is that our pre-existing sense of moral righteousness tends to be fairly consistent in our play
Mm.
spaces, and we're reluctant to ditch that, even when it would be of no cost to us
Mhm.
to do so.
Mm.
That's what the chaotic neutral characters get then.
Yeah.
I'll second that.
I mean, yeah, I speaking as somebody who's a couple of times has played in like an evil one shot or evil campaign, it's uncomfortable after a
Yeah.
while. It's like
Yeah.
makes you feel icky.
Yeah, people don't understand the ick factor a lot of the
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
Yeah.
And kind of shooting off of that, I was curious if you found in your own research or in research that you've seen from others, if there are any like more nuanced links between preferred types of games or even preferred play styles, methods of playing, and personality traits. Like, for example, a gamer who is very focused on the core quest versus one who's drawn more to exploration or side quest type stuff.
Yeah, there definitely has been some research in that area. I mean, I tend to be more involved in the sort of like, effects type stuff. So like
Yeah, yeah.
if you play this, does your brain melt?
Mhm.
Kind of stuff. But there definitely is a lot of that out
Mhm.
there. There's a lot of, there's a couple theories that are sort of related to each other. One's called self-determination theory,
Mhm.
and the other is uses and gratifications theory, which basically say kind of the same thing. Is that, a player's motivations for why they're playing determine a lot in terms of like what they choose to play, and then how they
Mm.
tend to choose to play it. And
Mhm.
there's even kind of research of like looking at Dungeons and Dragons and looking at terms of like how personality traits, so there's this idea, just to take a step back, that we really are all kind of, measurable on these kind of 5 basic personality traits. It's called the big 5, and it's like
Mhm. Mhm.
extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and
Hmm.
openness. I was going to say, I was going to forget one of them there. But so people that are high and low in these different traits may approach games differently, and may even approach their relationships with characters differently. So you tend to have, like in my situation, I tend to play. I actually tend to play a lot of female characters, and it tends to be sort of like I'm constructing another individual who I think is interesting and who's
Mm.
going to help sort of like narrate the story. And there's
Mhm.
this kind of like parasocial relationship between me as the player and this other individual who is the character. But I don't think of myself as being, the same person as,
Yeah.
this
Mm.
Yeah.
female, adventurer. Whereas other people may project themselves very directly into, this is basically
Mhm.
me, that is sort of running, or at least, at very least, an idealized me. If I was going to do this, you really wouldn't want a 50-year-old guy, who's like, getting a cookie stomach, and this kind of stuff, running around doing stuff. So it'd be like this big, strong me, maybe, or much smarter me, but it still would
Mm.
be me. And then you get other people that the PC is really just the mechanism for navigating through the story itself. So I
Mhm.
remember way back in the '90s. I don't even remember what video game this is, but it was one of these kind of, D&D based video games that was available at the time. And it was a series, and there's a friend of mine, and I would always like designing PCs. It's sort of similar to the Elder Scrolls, but it wasn't Elder Scrolls. I would take it very seriously and try to think of the right name for my character and the right
Mhm.
attributes. And my friend would be like, my character is, Horsey McHorsecock or something like that, and clearly didn't take the PC himself very seriously. It was really just, douchey McDoucheface, whatever, and sort of
Mm.
would play
Mm.
this, it really was just trying to get through the game.
Mhm.
So I think that a lot of that, like those different ways of coming at the game, are going to be depending upon personality style, and also what you're hoping to get, from, the game itself in terms of your motivations for playing it. And it sometimes can result. I mean, I was sort of taken aback, a little bit, like, wow, you're not really invested in your character at all.
Mm.
And that really wasn't his motivation for, playing through the game. He
Mhm.
really wanted to solve the puzzles and get the treasure and this kind of stuff, but not wasn't
Mhm.
terribly immersive in the, character building aspect of of the story. So people will definitely, their personality style will definitely determine a lot in terms of like media choices and how they engage with it, which also means that
Mm.
like what people get from media can be very different. How they perceive it
Mm.
can
Yeah.
be very different. We can even see this stuff with like the Bible. I mean, people come, this is the same book, but or other
Mhm.
religious texts like the Ramayana or whatever. It's the same book, but people come to it for different reasons and they get different things out of it. Some people want to feel like God is on their side, other people want to learn
Mm.
how to be a better person. Some people just want stress reduction, and others come to these books and learn how to hate people more, and it's a
Mhm. Mhm.
very idiosyncratic response. And a
Mm.
lot of that is determined by where people are starting from in the first place.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that. Quick aside. Are all people who are into farming simulators monsters, or is that
Yes.
just like
Yes.
okay?
That's provable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is no rational reason why that is fun. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
Good to know.
But they're like, what's the term for someone who likes to inflict harm upon himself?
Sadist or a masochist?
Masochist. Yeah.
Masochist.
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 Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There's a special place in the circles of hell for those players.
It's sort of like job simulators. I never got that
Mhm.
point
Yeah.
either. Like VR, here, be a chef in
Yeah.
virtual reality. I could do that in real life. I should get
Yeah.
paid for it. I don't know why I would do it. Not much with my cooking skills, but I don't know why that's fun. But
Look,
whatever.
even if your cooking skills were excellent, you still wouldn't get paid very much.
But there's no
Uh,
judgments here. Whatever people think is
Mhm.
fun, as long as it's not
Absolutely.
farming simulators.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely not those.
All right. Well, we'll check that off the list. That's great. Yep.
Is there any, so like it's briefly mentioned, if I could remember, in Mortal Kombat, like touched on like VR stuff. Is there any new research that's like on the edge into VR that has revealed anything interesting that you know of?
Yeah, there's been a couple studies. But it depends on what you consider interesting, I suppose. So there've been we did one at Stetson
Anything that's
University.
psychopathic?
No, nothing's like virtual reality is
Anything.
not going to turn you into a psychopath, unfortunately. Yeah, only bad genes. So we've done a couple studies on VR. So basically the same sort of platform of like comparing violent games versus non-violent games. Just doing it in virtual reality now because you get the the usual argument. Well, what about VR? Kids aren't going to be
Mhm.
able to distinguish reality from fiction. So all right, well, looks like we have a couple more studies to do. And so we've done that, which is actually pretty awesome for me because my university brought me a PlayStation 5, which is pretty sweet. But the results are pretty much the same. Playing violent games in VR. There's actually another group in New Zealand who've done some. Aaron Drummond has done some of this work as well, and the findings pretty much are the same as with regular video games. That there doesn't seem to be evidence that playing virtual reality games that are violent are going to increase aggression more than playing, whatever that lightsaber game is. I can't remember the name of that thing. But
Beat Saber.
Beat Saber, thank you. Yeah, I
Mhm.
couldn't recall that. So we're not seeing any additional VR effects,
Mhm.
but it is fascinating to watch these things. Even with like Pokemon Go, which is augmented reality, how for like a summer people freaked out about you know the idea that Pokemon Go was going to cause schizophrenia in kids.
Oh,
Wow.
jeez.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. There was an
Jeez.
op-ed that basically made that argument
Oh, jeez.
that
It must be founded by the competition.
Yeah.
yeah. So
Mm.
these things, we're trying to tamp them down quick, when they come out. But
Mhm.
you never know. I mean, it could be that at some point we'll cross some threshold of technology that this will really be the thing that
Mm.
causes some sort of negative effect. But the good news really is that if you look at fictional media, now news media, maybe social media are a little bit different. But if you look at fictional media across the board, we just don't see evidence that fictional media causes changes in behavior or attitudes.
Mm.
And the funny thing is when you tell people this, they'll get angry sometimes.
Mhm.
Mm.
Is good news, right? You don't have to worry about your kids so much, and then they get pissed that you
Good.
that you tell them it's not that big a deal.
Well, now they need a reason that they're shitty parents, and
Right.
that's just not acceptable.
Yeah. I've seen, again, I'm sort of both the right and the left. I've seen people get angry when you tell them like, oh
Mm.
yeah, video games aren't that big a deal, or 13 Reasons Why isn't really causing teens to commit suicide, and
Mhm.
people get pretty angry. It's like, oh, this is okay. You're not gonna be able to stop them from doing this stuff. Isn't it kind of good news that It's not really hurting them as much as you think, but people really kind of cling to that idea, and it's
Mhm.
sort of tough to let go of. And there's all these myths people come up with. The one I see the most is the Jaws myth. I don't know if you ever come across that one. The idea that the movie Jaws caused shark depopulations. So people will kind of refer to that
Wow.
Mhm.
fairly often, which it did not.
Mhm.
But people kind of go, "Oh yeah, well, what about the movie Jaws?" Well, what you think happened there is not what actually happened. But yeah.
Wow. One thing on kind of the topic of scientific literacy, for any of our listeners who might want to go look into research around these things on their own, do you have any recommendations for what to keep an eye out for in like papers and studies as far as sample sizes, types of trials, and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's really two things to look out for.
Mhm.
One is something called pre-registration, and I try not to go like too far into the weeds
Mhm.
and inside baseball with this, but basically that means that we've had a big problem in social science with, for a variety of reasons, scholars massaging their data to make it fit their
Mhm.
hypotheses when in
Yeah.
fact
Mm.
the story was, people can look up replication crisis in psychology on Google and there'll be a zillion articles about it. And even some of these big studies like the Stanford prison experiment and the
Yep.
Milgram study of electroshocks and
Mhm.
stuff like that are now
Yeah.
being, there are big asterisks on them now in terms of whether they really were true,
Hmm. Hmm.
in any kind of meaningful way. But so pre-registration is just something that scholars can do, where we basically publish our hypotheses and our methods and our data analysis plan in advance of collecting any data, which means we can't change it then when we get our data.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it makes it, or at least it makes it harder. Yeah, I shouldn't be challenging people to think of like clever ways of getting around this, but it makes it harder for scholars to manipulate their data
Mm.
because they've already said in advance what their hypotheses are and how they're going
Mhm.
to analyze it.
Mm.
So they're placing their money clearly down on the roulette wheel, if you will, with that sort of stuff. And the other thing is to watch out for is kind of the moral grandstanding tone. So scholarly articles really shouldn't be advancing policy or advancing moral arguments for the most
Mhm.
part. I mean, we're all human, so it's tempting to do it to some extent. But that's one thing to be cautious about. If scholars look like they're really advocating for a particular cause or moral worldview, that can be a sign that they may be sort of captured with that ideology somewhat and
Mhm.
really sort of
Mm.
attached to it. And it may actually be difficult for them to critically evaluate it. So those kind of things in combination, I think the pre-registration is probably more important. We're all human, so we all get, I'm no exception to it. We'll all get sort of, roped into some sort of worldview. But I would kind of look for both of those things,
Mhm.
where the data is open, the pre-registration is open. You can be a
Mhm.
bit more sure of the validity of those findings, and particularly if the scholar is trying to make some effort not to make themselves look like a moral champion. So if they're
Mm.
Yeah.
coming across pretty strong of, looking like they're a crusader for a cause, you might be a little bit wary.
Mhm.
Again, this is like smoking and lung cancer, that kind of
Right.
narrative
Right.
should be something of a red flag, and you can even see this with topics that I think are good science. The global warming is one I sometimes refer to. I fully
Mhm.
believe that humans are contributing to climate change, and this is something we should fix. But you'll see this like we're all going to die in 10 years, kind of thing. It's like, well, I don't know.
Yeah.
That might not be true. So those are the kind of things to look a little bit out for, and maybe be a little bit wary that some of those folks might have lost the thread a bit.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's really
The
helpful.
moral grandstanding question is like a perfect segue to one question I had, which I don't want to rehash your interview in Quillette, which I think really gets deep into this and covers it. But I'm thinking back to like, especially listening to the moral kind of book, like all the panics we've had, 80s Satanism, 90s kid violence, 2000s mass shootings, 2010 sex. And now in 2020, there's a question of like, does certain use of language make gamers racist? Do we
Yeah.
need to remove things like slavery? Is biological essentialism and RPGs cause for behaviors in players?
Mm.
So, like, and you cover this in Colette, but like, is this any different than those previous panics? And is there any evidence suggesting that these things have a connection?
No, it's very much like these previous panics. Is the honest truth of it? You know, it has a lot of similarities, and a lot of the things you can see that again would sort of clue us into perhaps being wary about some of this stuff
Mhm.
is the sort of lever that is used to insinuate that if you don't buy into the worldview that you're somehow a bad person. So
Mhm.
the argument isn't coming from
Mhm.
data that like, look, I can show you empirical studies that playing Dungeons and Dragons with evil orcs is increasing racist attitudes in players. That would be intriguing and important
Mhm.
data, and maybe we should
Yeah.
think about that if that is
Mhm.
indeed what the data is showing. But it's more the sense of like, well, if you don't support, removing slavery as a topic from Pathfinder, or you don't support the, changes to the alignment system as it refers to orcs and drow and other monster races, that you're
Mhm.
somehow supporting racism or prejudice, in the real world. And it's very similar to 30 years ago, that so if you are saying, and I got this very directly, I if you're saying playing Grand Theft Auto doesn't result in violent crime, does that mean that you don't like children? Or that are you getting no, I'm serious. This is
Yeah.
like this is true.
Wow.
Yeah, or of course it'd be like, well, you must be in league with the video game industry. It's a very common one
Mhm.
as well. That
Mhm.
that's yeah,
Oh, of
it's
course. Yeah, you're a shill.
yeah, you're a bad person. Argument is kind of the common thing. And there again, I think if people, it's basically ad hominem, and if people's worldview relies on that for persuasion, I mean, it can be persuasive because people want to be on the good side, right? But if that's what we're relying on for persuasion, that is to me concerning, and so we don't have a lot of data on the impact of playing Dungeons and Dragons under the sort of traditionalist model, which means that
Mhm.
orcs were evil, or drow are evil, and slavery was a thing that exists in these. It's an
Mhm.
evil thing. In Pathfinder, it was always an evil that was meant to be
Mhm.
fought,
Yeah.
but it was a topic that came up certainly.
Yeah.
And but so that's why I did conduct this most recent study looking at, and it was a survey based study, and it was really trying to address what I thought were two of the key arguments from sort of the progressive side. Now there is this kind of progressive versus traditionalist sort of culture war, but I was sort of the arguments I seemed to see that were testable at very least, other than you're just a douche if you don't sort of agree with me. But the sort of the testable arguments were the this is causing a change in people's attitudes regarding race or ethnicity in a negative direction, and there's some sort of consensus, perhaps among players or perhaps among non-white players specifically, that this is a bad thing and this needs to change. And those are both
Mhm.
testable, hypotheses.
Mhm.
And the short version of, in the study that I did, and granted, it's only one study, and I love to see other people replicate it in different settings with different samples and stuff. They're as is pretty consistent with other forms of media. There was no relationship between playing Dungeons and Dragons and racist attitudes in real life, and there was
Mhm.
no consensus, including among people of color, that evil orcs, were offensive or racist.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So it sort of suggests that this, again, is kind of a minority view who are passionate, and I think they're speaking in with good intention, but they are a minority view, and they're kind of using the sort of moral lever to get a lot of power in this debate,
Mhm.
but they don't necessarily represent a majority view among players or even players of color specifically. And that doesn't mean that we should ignore them necessarily, that they are the losers here and they should all go away. But I think, we do need to rebase this dialogue, this debate in the data. And
Mhm.
here
Mhm.
again, the news is kind of good, that you can play with evil orcs,
Mhm.
Right.
and people do not make the assumption that race essentialism, if that's what we're going to call it, in Dungeons and Dragons, means that they should adopt those views in their real lives. And most players, including most players of color, are okay with evil orcs. That's not something that's really on their radar screen for the
Mhm.
most part. And yeah, the hope is that with that, you can say, well, here's some good news. And with that data, that can help shape the debate, going forward. And the resolution I'd love to see is for traditionalists and progressives to actually somehow come together
Mhm.
and work out
Mhm.
compromises.
Mhm.
Because otherwise, we get these endless culture wars that just go on, and they don't. ever really entirely seem to resolve until one group dies, because they just
Yeah.
got so old in some cases, So, but I think that's going to do a lot of damage to the Dungeons and Dragons system or the Pathfinder system. Is if they go either if they went all woke or if they went all traditionalist. I think that would be a
Yeah.
mistake, and they really need to figure out a way rather than signaling virtue, which is kind of what they're trying to do. I think maybe I'm attributing more bad motives than I really mean to, but they're sort of signaling allegiance to sort of wokeism because they think that's what they have to do in order to maintain sales and not get in trouble on Twitter. And I think it would be somewhat to their benefit, there being Wizards of the Coast and Paizo, their benefit to kind of take the Coinbase, Trader Joe's approach of saying, well, we're going to keep doing what we're doing because looks like most people are buying it, but they could also say, we're open to making some changes, but only if like people can come together and agree that these change, majority of people can agree these changes are in a positive direction, who are both progressives and traditionalists. Like, if you're changing, I actually think some of the mechanistic changes they're making are good. If you're giving players more flexibility in terms of, so if you want an orc wizard, with a 28 intelligence, why not? I mean, that's fine. That gives the players more flexibility. That's a good thing. If you're doing it to give players more flexibility, that's wonderful. If you're doing it because you don't want to get in trouble with the woke on Twitter, that's not so wonderful,
Right.
And so I think that's what a lot of people are reacting to. It's not that the mechanistic changes are necessarily bad or even the story changes are bad, but that there's this perception that it's really kind of caving to a illiberal, kind of trend on the far left. And that could be bad, if that is allowed to continue in many ways. Just as it would be bad if we were to passively acquiesce to liberal tendencies on the far right, so this isn't a far left, far right, one's better than the other thing. It's just that, we don't want to find ourselves captured by these, minority, but very passionate, very outspoken ideologies on either side of our political divide.
And then I think a major problem that we're seeing with that is just the platform on which these discussions take place are not conducive to actual conversation.
Yeah.
True.
They are mind poison or a misery treadmill, which is just like, it is not designed to change minds. It is designed to entrench ourselves within our preconceived notions of that we already hold.
The Twitter hellscape we were talking about earlier. Before you came on.
Well, not just Twitter, it's social media. I would argue that it's probably social media in general. Yeah. Like, you need longer form like options if you're really going to try and change someone's mind. That's kind of how I feel about it.
And I think most people know this, but they still do it. You know what I mean? So it's they kind of are aware that this is a problem, but they tend to see the problem as more on the other side, right? So yes, it's absolutely true that Twitter is a dark, deep, evil hole of right-wing extremism. It's kind of how they'll think of it. Which it is. It is, but it's also a dark, evil, disturbing hole of left-wing extremism. And even, centrists can be assholes too, So
absolutely.
There's no good guys, in this particular debate. I think too, the argument that, again, sort of thinking in terms like moral levers, is this argument also you'll see of like, well, what's the harm in it? So let's say you're right, that there's really no link between
Pascal's wager, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, essentially what it is.
It does become the sense of, well, right now, what we know, or from a limited, certainly amount of data, but the data suggests that what we're doing right now is not necessarily causing any harm. So there is a sort of sense of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But there also is this sense of, like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Luciano talked about in their book, The Coddling of the American Mind. We have seen this massive increase in mental health problems across all age groups. It's not a teen thing. And we don't know why it's occurring, but one of the theories that Haidt and Luciano have advanced is the sense of safetyism, the fact that we're actually we're shielding people too much. We're actually every time someone's reads something they don't like, they're traumatized and they have to run to an authority figure to try to like destroy the person's life who rather than saying like, well, don't read that thing anymore, or just get a grip somewhat. You know what I mean? Like it's not about you. You don't have to, you don't have to catastrophize it or generalize it or personalize it,
Mhm.
necessarily.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
I think a lot of what we're doing, particularly with the young today, is the opposite of what we do in therapy. We try to tell people not to catastrophize, not to
Mhm.
personalize, not to generalize. But
Mm.
now what we're doing with our young folks is the opposite, where every slight is an emergency and you must be
Mhm.
shielded from hearing viewpoints that you don't like.
Right.
That a joke from 1987 means that you can no longer have a career, and all this kind of stuff.
Mm.
I wouldn't be surprised on the point of the research that we have, which shows no effect, if because we have violent video games actually having the effect of decreasing violence in the real world. I wouldn't be surprised if future research, and of course this is speculation,
Yeah,
demonstrates that exposure to things that are
Mhm.
uncomfortable, especially in the
yeah,
safe environment of an
Yeah.
RPG,
Yeah.
actually can help you better deal with those situations and
right,
Yeah.
understand them. So it would have an
right,
Mhm.
opposite effect. I would be surprised if that's the case.
Right, like confronting what makes you
Mhm.
uncomfortable and really examining why that is
Mm.
rather than just being like,
Exactly.
"Oh, I don't wanna deal with that."
yeah,
Especially the case of, like, slavery,
yeah,
like,
Mhm.
if it's an uncomfortable topic, it's a dark thing in our past and our present, and
Mhm.
it's like, if we can grapple with that at RPG, what safer place do you have to interact with, fight that, and have a chance of, like, actually overcoming it in a
yeah.
fiction
Mm.
than an RPG?
Mhm.
Well, it's fascinating too. Like, it wasn't that long ago necessarily that we were encouraged to talk about slavery. And so
Right.
it's sort of
Mm.
fascinating to watch that narrative come around.
Oh yeah.
And of course, it used to be if people were opposed to it, it was sort of this like, well, it's white people just trying to be, shielding
Mhm.
themselves from discomfort.
Mhm.
And now the argument
Mhm.
is that people of color, needed to be shielded from exposure to
Yeah.
slavery as a topic. So it's funny to see the sort of full circle of some of this narrative. Now, I agree that we should be talking about slavery. We shouldn't be worried about shielding white people from the realities of our history in terms of
Oh yeah.
racism and slavery and that kind
Right.
of stuff.
Mhm.
In fairness, we also should acknowledge that other societies did the same thing, including indigenous and
Mhm.
African societies. So we shouldn't
Mhm.
shield people from that either.
Right.
But we do need to encourage people to be able to handle these difficult topics and learn to develop the resiliency. And of course you can take this to absurd levels of say, well, does that mean that we should let children who are being abused stay in their families and get abused? Well, no, of course
Right.
not. I mean,
Right.
there
Right.
there obviously are always going to be some common sense, hopefully, limits to some of the stuff.
Mhm.
Although I sometimes joke that common sense really isn't all that common. But so yeah, I mean, in general, you don't want to shield people from everything, that is going to
Mhm.
cause
Mhm.
Right.
mild stress. And that is the potential harm here, is if we're basically sort of bubble wrapping, you know, role playing games and bubble wrapping life more generally, that actually could have some negative impacts on people in terms of making them less resilient to real struggles.
Doesn't work with regular germs if you put someone in a
Yeah.
bubble.
Yeah.
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 You need some level of inoculation, and like, would you argue that like seeking discomfort on a safe level, like I suppose that's kind of where we're at, where it's like finding the right level of discomfort,
Yeah.
because from personal experience, obviously anecdotal, but like it is when I'm confronted with things and I am uncomfortable and have that
Yeah.
opportunity to be really uncomfortable that I tend to grow or change, or at least am able to even galvanize some of the opinions that I may have. I mean, there's hours of Daniel and I yelling at each other about why the other one's wrong,
So
but I think
Yeah.
fulfilling
that
too.
having those conversations
Mhm.
allows us
Yeah.
to figure out the nuances of the
Mhm.
topic that
And
we're
understand each
discussing.
other.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is critically lacking is this idea of being able to approach a text, and by text I mean literally anything,
Yeah.
with some kind of criticism. I think that Marlon James, who's a fantastic author, would recommend reading all of his stuff. Basically, he says that there is a great joy in tearing a book apart,
Yeah.
and I think that that is something that we have lost, where we are not allowed to read something and dislike it. We have to read something that is good. And if it's not good, then it's bad. And then we reject it and it's bad. We
Yep.
don't examine why it's bad. We
Yeah.
just know that it's bad.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, I definitely advocate that people should get out there and read books from perspectives they don't agree with.
Oh yeah.
So and
Mhm.
that does seem to be a lost skill. And what happens oftentimes, we see these debates over something, and you can ask people, well, have you read the book? And oftentimes they'll say, well, no, why would I don't want to,
They never would. Yeah.
Yeah.
well, you don't know what's in it then, and and oftentimes by reading, so I mean, I've read stuff on the, I guess, what we call the far right, now, or at least, pretty far on the right. Yeah, some of it's pretty ridiculous. Start chuckling with some of it, and I've read stuff on the far left. I'm not a fan of critical race theory, but I made an effort to like read, the arguments from people in that perspective, and
Mm.
and I think what happens is, to the extent now that if it comes down to, my critiques of something like critical race theory, well, I know what they said. I know what the actual, like
Mm.
Delgado and Crenshaw, I know what the actual people said, so it's not like these Republican governors who are trying to ban stuff and they don't know what the hell they're
Mhm.
banning necessarily.
Right.
And that comes across pretty
Mm.
badly, and same thing, if you're criticizing, J.K. Rowling or Abigail Schreier, for their comments about like trans individuals, at least read the book or read their essays. Don't just
Right.
go by what was on Twitter,
Mm.
because oftentimes, you can disagree with them, and in fact, I disagree
Mhm.
with them on many points. But oftentimes, what you think they said and what they actually said are different things, and you don't look very persuasive if you don't know what they actually said.
Right.
And so you're not going to like explode if you read, J.K. Rowling's essay on her views of, you may disagree passionately with them, and that's fine.
Absolutely.
And same
Yeah.
thing if you're on the right, you're not going to explode if you read, Ibram Kendi necessarily. You may read the
Mm.
whole book going, "Oh my God, this is so stupid." That's fine.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
but
You
you're
should
more
be able to
informed.
read something and hate it and know
Yeah,
why you hate it, and
Mm.
then have a
exactly.
good reason to hate it or
Hmm.
not hate it or
Mm.
love it, whatever.
We don't want to be those congressmen who are talking about the video games that
Oh
they
my
had never
god.
seen, like
Yeah.
Right.
in the Mortal
Oh
Kombat book, to
god.
bring it completely full circle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The
yeah, yeah.
guys who had never, what was that video game that
You're
you?
about to say Night Trap,
Yes,
aren't
Yeah.
you? Yeah.
yes.
I already know.
That's
I already know, yeah.
Do not be a Night Trap player.
Yeah. All right. I think that's a great place to pivot into our world building, Jen, because
Mm.
I don't think we're going to get more peak than Night Trap Senator. So, yeah, let's bust out the dice. And for those of you who aren't aware, the way that this works is that we're going to create a scenario, a fantastical scenario, with the help of some dice rolls to kind of guide us in the right direction. So, first things first, we're going to roll for the genre. And the genre that we're going to be focusing on today is going to be a good old sword and sorcery genre.
Oh.
So
Nice.
think Conan the Barbarian. You want to think Michael Moorcock, maybe, although he's more a little bit. Anyway, next up, we're going to be rolling for the theme. The theme of our scenario is going to be something forbidden. Oh my.
Mm.
Ooh.
And then finally, the thing that we're going to be focusing on during this scenario is an historic event. So, Chris, you are our guest. You have to start us off. What are you thinking when we've got a sword and sorcery tale with a theme of something forbidden and we're focusing on an historic event?
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that sounds exciting. So first, I think the essence I always got from like the sword and sorcery stuff is really these kind of like, old empires kind of like rising up from these sort of like primitive structures and very power
Ooh.
focused. And I think it's like the Conan Barbarian. So where there's magic, it looks more like sorcery, kind of wild magic-y kind of stuff rather than highly learned wizardry
Mm.
types of stuff. And if it's historical, I'm kind of thinking of like, we can kind of place this in different areas, but either something like ancient China or ancient Egypt or the Sumerians
Oh, yeah.
or, Mesoamerican, like early Mesoamerican culture or something like that. This kind of like early empire rising up from, you know, basic agriculture and these really authoritarian rulers trying to take charge
Mm.
of the wider population. And I don't know. That sounds like a pretty good place to start. I don't know if we have a preference for like if we're thinking like
Mm.
historically, like which area of the world we would want to focus it in on. But they're so little known, right? Who knows if the ancient Egyptians had magic, right? That's why they built the pyramids.
Absolutely. Well, it's aliens to
They
some
had aliens.
people. So
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously.
I don't
Yeah.
believe this to be.
Of course.
I know there
No,
are
no,
people
no,
out there
no.
that believe this, so I just want to make it clear I'm not advocating
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. I had a friend of mine who took a course in archaeology that was called Ancient Aliens.
Yeah.
And the entire course was the professor debunking every
Oh, I
single
see.
claim of ancient
That's
aliens.
fun. That would be cool.
Oh
That's
yeah,
good.
I was like, that's brilliant. I want that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think what we want to focus on is what's the historic event that we want to talk about. So is this a battle? Is it the signing of a Magna Carta? We're sword and sorcery. We're thinking of like archaic power structures. Is it a rise to power? Is the fall of a previous empire? Like, what are we thinking when it comes to this type of stuff?
Well, one possibility. I'm just reading a history of Hawaii, actually, and
Oh.
they don't really get a lot of love in fiction.
Mhm.
And of course, this is for us is fairly recent history. But even a couple hundred years ago, there was this sort of conquering
Mhm.
of all of the Hawaiian islands by a single ruler. And I'm gonna mangle his name. It was like Kanamena. I don't.
Kamehameha.
Yeah, there we go. Okay,
Yeah.
you had it right. Yeah. So maybe thinking of that, that sort of like coming out of like the blackness. There not being any written history before that time period, and using this kind of barbaric and perhaps some sort of like basic magic to overcome the resistance of the other islands. Would something like that work?
Yeah.
So we've got a singular person who's unified an archipelago for the first time. So this is like the formation of an empire is what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now we have the theme of something forbidden. So now we obviously have to go with what's the forbidden part. Courtney and Daniel, I'd love to hear from you.
I mean, you know me. I'm always down.
Okay,
for
we're
blood
not talking about
sacrifice.
blood sacrifice,
Add
Courtney.
blood, Courtney.
We're
do it.
not talking
do it.
about
Add
blood.
blood. Menstrual
Every
blood.
time, Courtney.
Every time.
Every time.
That's a good. If it's not blood sacrifice, you're gonna have to give me a
It's
minute.
not.
You're gonna have to give me a minute.
She has a penchant for this, Chris.
I don't understand it. I really don't.
It's fun.
Well, if it helps, that actually would not have been forbidden in the ancient Hawaii. So.
All right.
Okay. Yep.
Hmm.
So what, again, something forbidden. What's the forbidden thing? That I'm going to say that whatever the forbidden thing is the reason that this figure has ascended to power. Like them doing the forbidden thing has allowed the archipelago to be united in some way. I like that kind of narrative. So that's where
Yeah.
I'd like to go. What do we have?
What if they're like selling their soul to a demon figure, something like that, like joining with some sort of underworld type group?
Yeah.
I mean, if we're basing it off a Hawaiian culture, can't we just have it be like a cool volcano god or a nature spirit of something like that?
Volcano demon.
Why not, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe it's I mean, if it's uniting a series of islands, what's more important than the volcano is probably the god of the seas or the predator of the seas. So it's like this god of the deep of some kind.
Yeah, I like that. Like some sort of Leviathan type creature.
I mean, we could have your blood sacrifice because
Yeah,
then you can chum the water,
Yeah.
in order for
Just
that
throw
to
some
kind of
babies
like
in there, and
Yeah.
yeah.
why
Gotta
not?
feed it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's gotta be fed. Is it one entity or is it like multiple sea entities?
That's a good question. What are we thinking?
Maybe they had been multiple, but something that this figure has done has merged them into one like ultra powerful.
Yeah.
And
figure.
that's the forbidden thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So we've essentially taken what were known as the many gods of the sea, and you've essentially forced them to coalesce into a singular entity through some kind of foul forbidden magic.
Oh, had they been shattered in the past and bringing them together again is what's forbidden? And then this leader has brought them together as he will bring together the islands, or she.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's like a fun thing. And so you're island hopping, like reuniting these
Yeah,
shards.
the
of
islands are
Yeah.
the thing. Like each island is one of the gods that's been shattered, and he's gonna literally bring them together.
Okay, yeah, that's pretty fun. I think I can get behind
Yeah.
that. I think we're losing sword and sorcery a little bit by doing that, but I don't fucking
I
care.
mean, it could be
These are all
Conan-esque.
loose
You
rules.
got, like,
I don't fucking care.
tsunamis and earthquakes and shit.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. But all right.
Well, there could be some like conflict between the magic of the volcano and the magic of the
Oh,
sea, right?
Yeah,
Perhaps
that's
that's where the
true.
Mm,
forbidenness is
yeah.
too. That if the Hawaiians were mostly worshiping, I think it was Pele was the volcanic goddess, and now they're turning away from her, to the
Hmm.
sea. Maybe that's part of the
oh,
struggle. Maybe there's this like priesthood or priestesses of Pele who are kind of like the leftover remnants of their
Oh
whole
man,
system, and
Mm.
whether they're the good guys or the bad guys, I'm not really sure, but that might be part of the conflict.
that's cool.
Mhm.
well, maybe we can roll a twist and figure out if that's going to help us in any way.
Yeah.
Because now it's time. I feel like we've gotten to a solid foundation for where we're at for the setting. So I'm going to roll a twist and we'll see what happens.
Mhm. I was gonna say though that if we have this kind of counter faction that's worshiping the volcano, maybe their goal is to set it off,
Yeah.
Oh, to
to
stop
counter
unification.
whatever's
Hmm.
happening with the sea. Yeah.
Oh
Mm.
yeah, okay. So it's like a race between the
Mhm.
unification and the complete utter destruction of the archipelago,
Mhm.
essentially.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and now we have sacrifices on both end. You got people tossing virgins into the volcano, chumming.
Perfect.
Courtney, this is your setting. It's a
Love it.
bonanza of blood sacrifice. It's great.
Bonanza blood sacrifice. That's what the book is called.
Well, I think it would be blood sacrifice bonanza if because
Yeah. Yeah.
like just rolls off the tongue better.
Yeah, it
I
sounds
think.
better.
All right, that's fine. I'm totally okay with that. Now I'm gonna roll the die and see what our twist is. Let's see what we got. So our twist is Big Brother is watching. Big Brother, of course, in quotations. So
Oh.
that means, I mean, we can really take that to be as literal or as figurative
Mm.
as we want it to be.
Mm.
Mhm.
Well, I think two directions occur to me. Is one is that could perhaps play back into the sort of volcanic goddess, Pele is somehow
Mhm.
monitoring all this
Mm.
apprehensively, or perhaps you could even bring it into this was about the time that the United Kingdom was
Oh,
discovering
yeah.
what they then called the
Um,
Sandwich Islands, and so perhaps they're probably malevolent force
yeah.
No, that's
involved in this.
perfect.
Yeah.
Having an imperialist force kind of like waiting, encircling the island and
Hmm.
waiting to see what
Mhm.
happens and like waiting it out. That's a really interesting idea.
Mhm.
You could even have like these like spies that start showing up and you're like, oh, that's interesting, that's strange, like that are like precursors to a coming kind of war of some kind.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Did we nail it? Was that it? Did we just do it in one?
I think so. We've got,
Yeah.
I mean, to recap, we have this sea god that's been shattered being brought back together to unify the islands, both figuratively and literally. We've got a volcano god opposed to that happening, a cult of
Mhm.
the volcano goddess, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's supposedly opposed to that, and a leader who is doing the unification, and then this little last bit we added, right?
There we go.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think we're good. All right.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, with that out of the way, the world building jam comes to an end. We're now going to roll into some rapid fire questions. Chris, I always ask if you're ready. No one ever is. So we're just going to roll into it. Chris Ferguson, my wife wants to know, is cereal a soup?
Is cereal a soup? No.
All right.
Yes.
And second question, what have you been playing recently?
Oh, what I've been playing recently. So on video games, I've actually gone back and I'm playing an old video game called Prey.
Oh, yeah.
So with a lot of video games, I end up picking up games my son has been playing, and so he played that before, and so I'm giving that a try now. It's pretty good. I'm really bad at it, but it's pretty good. And of course, I'm always playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I'm DMing one game and playing in two others.
Nice.
Nice. You said you were into Pathfinder briefly. Are you on Pathfinder 2 or are you D&D 5e now?
I'm mostly D&D 5e.
Mhm.
So we have these like campaigns that go on forever. So the hope is that
Mm,
when one of these ends, we're going to give Pathfinder 2e a try.
Mhm.
gotcha. Rapid fire questions from Daniel and Courtney. Go ahead.
What's your favorite RPG character you've ever played?
Ooh.
Oh, which of my children do I love the most? Oh, let's see.
No pressure.
I only have one, so it's no. I probably so actually, like I said, I like to play a lot of female characters, and
Mhm.
I actually way back in first edition, they produced in Dragon magazine this witch class actually, and I was also really big into Stevie Nicks at the time. So there's all kind of like it's all part of one big story.
Chris, you should still be into Stevie Nicks. She's one of the best musicians of all time. Don't come at me about like Fleetwood Mac's Rumors is a perfect album except for one song. Like, come on.
Yeah. I'm
Anyway.
with you. I'm with you. Totally. Yeah.
I'm very passionate about Stevie Nicks. Okay?
No argument here. Yeah. So I actually played this character, Zafrida was her name, back in first edition, and she was based on that Dragon Magazine 114. I still remember the episode, the edition, based on this witch class. And I actually, in one of my more recent games, basically resurrected her and played her again in fifth edition, and just had a ball both times. So I'd say she's probably still my my favorite character.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Now I need you to kill your children. What was your favorite character death?
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So in fourth edition, I played a, again, female sorcerer. Her name was Diana, which happens to be my wife's name. And she had a really epic death. So actually it was like in, I think the second because I think they went up to level 30 in fourth edition. So I think it was around level 20 or either late teens or early 20s. And the gist of it, without getting to a huge narrative, was, as part of the role play, it was kind of like the Walking Dead sort of scenario that the DM presented me with a situation where she could sacrifice herself to save like literally millions of others, or she could continue on with this quest and still perhaps save them, but it would take, a longer adventure, and it may or may not work out.
Wow.
And she, I made the decision that she would go ahead and sacrifice herself in order to save these, millions of others, and, just civilians in some world or whatever. And it was really an epic moment. It probably doesn't come across. I'm trying to describe it in a minute and a half, but it really was this epic moment. And she was also one of my favorite characters. And in terms of like player attachment stuff, I literally had nightmares for like days afterward.
Wow,
that's because she died. And but I mean, not nightmares like they were terribly unpleasant. It was like, but it was that sense of grieving for having lost the character. But it really was this, like, in terms of the narrative, it really was this sort of epic death that and she as a character had chosen in the situation. So yeah.
Wow. All right. Second to last question is there. I would love for you to name someone who you would love to shout out who is not yourself.
Oh, okay. I'll be the first person that comes to mind would be my wife, who's always supported me in everything I've done. I've been, super, super lucky in finding my best friend and being able to spend my life with her. And I can't imagine what my life would have been like had that not been the case. Probably wouldn't have been as productive, in terms of like resources and stuff too. So she would obviously be the person I'd love to shout out. And then, also my dad, who died 5 years ago, always like to give him a shout out whenever I can, because he was a good guy and a good dad. So I've been lucky with the people that have been involved in my my family life for sure.
Absolutely. And finally, where can people find you and your work?
Well, now that we said that Twitter is a hellhole, they can follow me on Twitter at CJ Ferguson 1111. And I also have a website, which is just my name. So it's ChristopherJFerguson.com. Not very original. And then my books, if people get really enticed by them, they can help me put my son through college by buying them on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or any place else they buy books.
Fantastic. All right. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been a lot of fun for me too. Again, thanks for having me on, and have a great day.
And we're back. I have to say, really great discussion. I feel like we probably could have kept talking for at least another hour.
Easily. Yeah.
Especially about what was it called? Night, the game that has the women in it, the senator.
Night Trap. You're talking about Night Trap, Daniel.
We could have kept talking about Night Trap for some distance, I think.
I was actually more interested in like his fiction and like maybe talking about like that type.
Yeah, we never got to that.
No, we didn't, and that is unfortunate. However, we do have to keep these interviews at a reasonable amount, I think.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, but you know, we have lives and we have to respect our guests' wishes and stuff like that.
I mean, my follow-up question would have been, if I had another rapid fire, it's what's his favorite serial killer? Because he's into like dark
that's
psychological horror.
you know what?
fiction.
We'll fire that off at him on Twitter. I'm sure that we can get a good response. It might be someone we might even find underrated ourselves.
An underrated serial killer.
Yeah, like
Mitch
Carl
McConnell,
Pansram or I don't know, like Henry Lee Lucas. There's a bunch of them.
Who is the Zodiac killer? He's in our government.
Ted Cruz.
Ted Cruz's dad.
Right?
No, not Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz's dad.
Oh no,
No,
I'm
I
saying
thought
it's
it
Ted
was-
Cruz.
No, he's too young. You don't understand how time works unless he's an immortal
Ted
time
Cruz
being.
could have been 10.
Maybe it's more like a title thing, like the old Zodiac killer dies and then it's transferred down, like a
Yes.
Dread Pirate Roberts kind
So
of.
it's like the Dread Pirate Roberts, but of
Yeah.
serial
Yes,
killers.
Yeah,
he's still
Gotcha.
killing Ted Cruz.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Ted Cruz kills through poor management and like infrastructure. So yeah, I guess
He
you're not
industrialized
wrong.
serial killing.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. That okay. We're getting hyper political where we really don't need to. But again, I thought that was some really great, interesting points. Again, nuance is dead if you want to have any conversations about anything. You can't do it online. I
It's tough,
thoroughly
yeah.
believe that.
Send us a Twitter at our hellscape at
Yes.
hellscape
Yeah.
at twitter.com.
Yeah, exactly. It really, it should be twitter.hs for hellscape, but I don't think that the branding would work out for them, unfortunately. I imagine that people would take
Sadly,
offense. Yeah,
I guess, yeah.
unfortunately. I think that's going to do it for this episode. I again had a ton of fun. A big thank you to Dr. Chris Ferguson for coming on with us. And remember that if you want us to build your world, you go to our website, Worldbuild with us. We'll build it for you eventually. It's fine. If you want to follow us on social media, the Hellscape, we are still over at Let's Worldbuild on Twitter. You can join our Discord if you want to have real conversations with us, or at least as real as you can get on the internet, with a link for that in the description. And if you're feeling particularly generous, you can give us money over on Patreon for our sweet, sweet patron-only episodes, or just because you're just a good person, or a generous person. You don't necessarily have to be good in order to give us money. Just want to throw that out there. You're more than willing to be a terrible person. But that'll do it for this episode of World Build with us. Remember that we love you very much, and we're going to get through this together. Until next week.